Welcome back. My name is Chris, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at consumer packaged goods, better known as CPG. And that is really a broad umbrella that includes everything from food and beverage products to health and beauty, cosmetics, household products, and even pet products. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at that entire industry and specifically those companies within the realm of CPG that would be having anything to do with NetSuite. So that's small to mid-sized businesses. We're not going to be looking at things like Procter & Gamble or Nestle, etc. And when taking a look at that for small to mid-sized businesses, you're really talking about three primary revenue streams. Starting off with by far the most common, that's direct to consumer, DTC. So that's through either Amazon or maybe an e-commerce store like Shopify. It can also be done through a more brick and mortar retail outlet. And then you have the second revenue stream, which is big box retailers. And when we say big box retailers, the term implies these larger stores, often chain stores. So that can range from anything from Walmart, Costco, that might be Petco, Whole Foods, Best Buy, whatever the brand or the specific niche is, any kind of large chain store that you would then be selling your products to in a wholesale bulk setting, and then they sell that product to their own customers. And then the third category is wholesale. So obviously there's a wholesale element with the big box retailers, but this is anything that is not a chain. So it might be a specialty store, a one-off store. It can also be with just an individual customer who is buying in bulk. Another aspect to keep in mind when we're looking at these small to mid-sized businesses that are in the CPG industry is the fact that there is either predominantly or entirely the manufacturing process is outsourced. So they're going through a co-manufacturer that is actually producing the goods, whether it's makeup or dog bones or t-shirts or whatever it is. These things are being produced at another location and then a 3PL is actually shipping them out to the customers, regardless of which revenue stream it is. So with that general concept in mind in terms of CPG clients, let's now take a look at each particular revenue stream and talk about some of the important things to keep in mind with these revenue streams, especially in relation to NetSuite. So first off, we have direct to consumer. And really the first point I would make, if you look at those three revenue streams, they go in order of frequency. So if you've got a very small CPG business, more often than not, you're going to start out with direct to consumer. You're going to buy a Shopify website, or you're going to have some kind of small business website that you're going to use to start selling your products because it's very easy to start and it's often very low cost to begin. Then when you build up a business, you get some brand recognition, etc., you're able to build those relationships with the big box retailers. You then branch into that market, increase the size of your business, and then at some point along the line, you may or may not get to the point where you have some of these wholesale customers that are, again, specialty stores, individual customers, etc. So taking a look at that first revenue stream of direct to consumer, this is 99% of CPG businesses, at least as a starting point for these companies. And even within that grouping, you have probably 80% of them are relying, at least in some part, on a Shopify website or something like Amazon. So with those two in mind, you have to think about a couple different elements, especially in relation to NetSuite. You need to have the connection from, again, whether it's a Shopify site or Amazon to the actual NetSuite ERP. And many of these businesses also rely on a 3PL or third-party logistics, a separate company that is going to be handling the shipping of the goods to the customers, or at least to some kind of distribution center that can go out. So it's either a 3PL, or for many businesses that are relying on Amazon for their sales, they might be doing it through FBA, which stands for Fulfilled by Amazon. In other words, Amazon's handling the actual logistical element of the sales. And when you're dealing with a 3PL, you need to keep in mind, let's say you've got your Amazon site and then you've got a 3PL and then you have NetSuite in the middle. You need something that's going to be able to allow a transfer of communication between these things. The orders need to come in from Shopify, come to your ERP system, get processed. Something needs to go out to the 3PL so they know what they're shipping out, who they're shipping it to, etc. All of these things need to work. And ideally it's set up so it's a very automated process. So the first step that you take along that route is to set up connectors between these things. A very commonly used one is Celigo. And even NetSuite has their own proprietary connector. It's something that previously was called FarApp. So you've got a number of different things to sync these different systems up. One additional point I want to bring up in relation to how it actually gets set up in NetSuite. Let's say you've got your Shopify store and there's 100 new sales coming in every single day. What you don't want to have happen is that it's pushing this information in NetSuite and then it's automatically generating 100 new customers in the system every day. You would quickly start to overload your system with all of that data. So the way it gets handled instead is that you basically set it up where the 3PL you're going to be using for your Shopify store, that gets set up as one customer. So when the information comes in from the Shopify store, it's going to be tied to that customer. That data then goes, and it still retains the transactional data, so you actually know what address you're sending it out to, etc. And then that can be passed on to the 3PL that then will ship out to that proper address. But again, from a NetSuite standpoint, you really just need one customer in the system for that Shopify account. If you're operating in multiple countries, let's say you have a Shopify store for US, a different one for Canada, great, that would be 2 customers. And if you're selling between Amazon and let's say 3 different e-commerce websites, then you would have 4. Amazon would similarly be treated as just one customer, one location in the system. And of course, for Amazon, it's a little different, but very similar concept. Especially if you're doing fulfilled by Amazon, Amazon's got its own distribution center. So you set up one customer for Amazon, it's one location, which is their distribution center. And of course, everything would go through there. Even if you have, let's say, your own 3PL that's sending it from your warehouse to the Amazon center, okay, good. Then you've got one customer for that, one customer for Amazon. That's it. That's basically how you would set that up. So it's a pretty simple setup. It does take some time to actually link up these connectors, and of course they cost money, but the configuration of it is not difficult. And it's not difficult to set up the necessary workflows to automate this entire process. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a graphic now. I'm going to pull up. And in this graphic, I want to walk you through the flow of how this works when an order comes in, how it's fulfilled, the payment, etc. So I'm going to break this into 3 categories. We've got the top section or swim lane, if you will, is going to be the actual e-commerce store. So let's say that's your Shopify website. Then you have the middle, which is what is happening in NetSuite. And then at the bottom, we're going to have basically what's happening with your 3PL, regardless of what your 3PL is, fulfilled by Amazon, doesn't matter. Same basic concept. So to start off, you're obviously going to have a customer is going to go on the Shopify website and they're going to purchase something. So there's going to be an order generated in the Shopify store that then comes down through that connection, that integration, let's say it's through Celigo, from Shopify to your NetSuite. It automatically generates a sales order in NetSuite. That then triggers 2 things to happen. First off, because they're paying by credit card, there's a customer deposit that's created off of that to basically record what their credit card info is. And then at the same time, it through another connection, it brings that information over to the 3PL so that a sales order can be generated with the 3PL, one that can then be passed over to a fulfillment where the 3PL takes the items, they then ship it out to the relevant customer or further distribution center as necessary. Once that's done and the 3PL knows that they've shipped it out, they then pass that information back to NetSuite, which then results in the creation of an item fulfillment record in NetSuite. Again, that splits off into 2 things. First off, that information through the connection is passed back over to the Shopify store so that order fulfillment can be passed on to the customer, letting them know that this thing was in fact shipped out. From there, you then have an invoice record is created, and immediately after that, there is the deposit application, completing the sale overall. So that is that relationship between those 3 and how things would actually flow through. And again, this would be entirely automated start to finish using connections both from the e-commerce site to NetSuite and then NetSuite to the 3PL to have things, doesn't matter if you're doing 50 orders or 1,000 orders, these can all flow through. So that's taking a look at just the basic premise of how this works from a NetSuite standpoint for DTC. Now let's take a look at big box retailers. And let's use the example I gave earlier of we're making custom doggy bones and we're trying to get in with Petco. So that's our big box retailer. And when you're setting this up in NetSuite, you're going to have Petco, kind of like Petco headquarters or Inc., as a parent customer record. And underneath that, every individual location that you're actually sending your product out to will be a child customer record underneath that parent. So that's how you organize it initially. And when dealing with these, unlike what we looked at when we're talking about direct to consumer, where we've got a connector like Celigo, SuperSync, etc., to connect these systems up, when you're dealing with big box retailers, I'm not going to say always, but in the vast majority of cases, they are going to demand that you use an EDI integration. EDI stands for Electronic Data Interchange, and it's simply a system to transfer files of information between the big box retailer, also known as the trading partner, that's how it's commonly referred to as, and your NetSuite account. Even if you don't have a NetSuite account, let's say you're working out of QuickBooks or even Excel, you're trying to get in with Petco, they're going to say you need to work with our EDI. And what they're going to have is, let's say the EDI is TrueCommerce. TrueCommerce will have a portal. It's not that you necessarily have to have an integration set up with your own ERP system. You can go on to a portal with TrueCommerce that allows you to see the transactions, allows you to fulfill them. It gives you the necessary information and you work through that portal. However, that's a manual setup. You need to manually go onto it, see what's happening, fulfill the orders, etc., etc. And at a certain point, when you get enough traffic or enough trading partners that you're dealing with at a big box retailer level, you're going to get to the point where you want some kind of automated integration set up to facilitate that. So you're not having to manually go through for every single trading partner that you have. So again, assuming you're already on NetSuite, you then have an integration, an EDI integration that allows you to have your automated ERP system work with what's going on their side, not necessarily that they're dealing with NetSuite, but whatever system they are using, this EDI interchange of data between the two to allow things to flow through. And when you're talking about EDIs, there's really a few big dogs on the block. So I've obviously just referenced TrueCommerce. You also have SPS Commerce, and Celigo even recently came out with their own EDI integration option called BTB Manager. So the main thing to keep in mind is that it's very different than if you're just doing a connection using something like Celigo to, let's say, Shopify. When you're dealing with one of these EDI integrations, it is a much more involved process. The implementation of this, in other words, connecting these things together through an integration, can easily take 4 to 6 weeks for your first trading partner, just one. 4 to 6 weeks to get that set up. Every subsequent trading partner that you want to add after that, I would think with a 1 to 2 week time window. So if you're dealing with, let's say, 4 trading partners, that could easily be 5 weeks for the first one, and then let's say 4 or 5 additional weeks just for the remaining 3. So this can really quickly add up to months of additional implementation just to set up the EDI integrations. Just that one element, totally separate from everything else you've got going on with NetSuite to go live with the system as it stands. In addition to that, if you've got heavy customizations in your NetSuite instance, any kind of additional custom fields, etc., that you're building into your system, when you've got that EDI integration, that's going to need to be incorporated into that EDI because the information you're pulling over from the vendor has to match up with all these custom fields that you have in the system. So if you've got any of those heavy customizations existing, you can easily start multiplying those implementation times I just gave you. You can start extending those timelines out. It's just going to get more and more complex. One technique I've seen some companies use because they get a little bit daunted with that runway is if you've got some core trading partners that are absolutely imperative to have up and running when you go live on NetSuite, let's say there's 5 of those, start with those initially. And then if you've got 15 total trading partners, I've seen companies take the remaining ones and still utilize those EDI portals to manually handle those orders and then have the core business trading partners part of the actual go live process. So they can at least split those up so they don't extend their go live date for another year or 6 months or something like that. So that is one technique that you can keep in mind, but just be aware, no matter what option you go with, if you're dealing with an EDI integration, especially with multiple trading partners, it is going to be a long and arduous process. It's just something that is unavoidable. So with all of that in mind, let's now take a look at a graphic again, just to show how that flow works for big box retailers. All right, and we're gonna handle this graphic just like we did with the previous one where we've got these 3 swim lanes, starting with the trading partner at the top. We have our NetSuite instance in the middle and then our 3PL at the bottom. And again, we're assuming for the sake of this, because so many small businesses utilize a 3PL, that we are dealing with this. Obviously, it would be a little bit different if you're entirely handling the shipping yourself. So with that in mind, the big difference you're gonna see here is that with Shopify, obviously Shopify is not the customer. The customer is going through Shopify. So there is an additional element there, but in this case, the trading partner is the customer to us. So it's really going to start off with the trading customer putting in an order, which for them would be a purchase order, but for us, that's going to be a sales order. So they're going to originate their order for like 1,000 dog bones, if this is Petco. That then comes in through the EDI to NetSuite, which generates a sales order. Now that EDI connection, there's a convention, a coding convention in terms of which files are going. So if the sales order is initially coming in, that's often referred to as an 850. You can have other codes like 940 or 945. I'll put the numbers throughout. So if you hear these terms, you can get a bit of a better understanding of exactly what flow and what exchange of information is occurring based on that code. But you've got the sales order in the system. Now, this is not mandatory at this point, but oftentimes you can then automate an order acknowledgement to go back to Petco to alert them the fact that we did receive and we are going to be processing that order. And of course, at that point, the sales order is then going to go to our 3PL using an EDI to alert them to the fact that they need to process this order, ship out these 1,000 dog bones, etc., into these various locations. So the 3PL then has their order. They then fulfill that order, ship these things out. They then pass that information back into NetSuite, which of course, just as we saw in the previous example, that creates an item fulfillment record in NetSuite. Off of that, it actually generates what's called an advanced shipping notice. So that then goes to Petco, alerting them to the fact that these things were shipped out, are going to be received by them on a specific date, so they can plan for that information. And from that item fulfillment record at the same time, it generates the invoice record. Now, this is where it differs a little bit from the previous example, because it's not just a customer online who's giving us their credit card info. At this point, we generate the invoice. That invoice then needs to be sent to the, in this case, Petco, our trading partner, and it really finishes off that cycle. Of course, after that, our accounts receivable department will follow up with Petco, make sure we actually receive payment for that particular order, but that could come months down the line. That's really a different process. This completes on just a transaction to transaction basis how that EDI integration allows this flow from the trading partner through us to the 3PL and then back to them. Now, the last revenue stream that I outlined at the beginning was wholesale, as I commented earlier. This is a pretty broad category. It could be an individual customer. It might be one specific store. It totally depends. And for that exact reason, it's hard for me to comment on how exactly that gets handled from a 3PL standpoint, etc. It just depends on what the circumstance is. More often than not, you're going to use one variation of what I already showed you in the previous 2 graphics. The real point I want to make when it comes to this last category is that this is by far a less common revenue source for these type of small to mid-sized CPG businesses. Predominantly, they're going to be direct to consumer, and then those that grow enough and are able to branch into big box retailers often see a large expansion in their business, but still many of them just don't dip into wholesale, or it's such a small aspect of their business that it's not really worth diving into any further than that. And that's it in regards to CPG clients, especially in relation to NetSuite. Now, this was a little bit of a different style video for me where I'm just talking about an industry and how that relates to NetSuite. I can do a lot more videos like this talking about services-based industries, banking, etc. If you guys have any interest in that, please let me know down in the comments below. And if you found this particular video helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. So with all of that in mind, I hope to see you in the next video.